Can you see and hear me?
I can. Thank you, my lady. Good morning. Our first witness this morning is Jean Freeman. I'm sorry if I cut you off there, my lady.
No, you didn't. I was merely going to say that it has already been announced, but for those who are watching online, I am attending remotely today, but all other participants are present in the hearing room. Thank you, Mr Stowe.
Thank you. Can we call Jean Freeman, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, and take the Bible in your right hand.
Thank you.
Thanks, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Welcome back, Ms Freeman.
Good morning, my lady.
Would you please give the inquiry your full name?
Jean Tennant Freeman.
Thank you. You have very helpfully provided the inquiry with a witness statement for this module. It's in fact your sixth to the inquiry. The reference is INQ 000 531 855. It's 27 pages long and dated the 20th of December of 2024. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you very much. As indicated, you have given evidence to the inquiry before, but by way of very brief reintroduction, if I may, you are currently the Dean of Strategic Community Engagement and Economic Development at the University of Glasgow. Is that correct?
It is.
And pertinently for this module, in June 2018, you were appointed as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport in Scotland.
Yes.
And you held that role until May of 2021.
That's correct.
Thank you very much. The focus of my questions now, as you know, is the procurement of key medical equipment and supplies during the pandemic. As to your role in that, as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, is it right that you were ultimately politically responsible for ensuring that the health workforce in Scotland had access to appropriate PPE during the pandemic?
That's correct.
I want to look briefly, please, at the question of the PPE stockpile available to you in your role and for use in Scotland during the pandemic. Very briefly, by way of context, prior to the pandemic, Scotland owned a PPE stockpile as a portion of the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Programme, or PIP. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
The PIP was a joint planning and procurement venture by the four nations of the UK, is that right?
Yes.
And the idea of that was to ensure an adequate stockpile of PPE based on a reasonable worst-case scenario for an influenza pandemic.
Yes, that's right.
That was based on an assumed pandemic wave of 15 weeks.
Yes.
Is that your understanding?
Yes.
After which it was predicted that normal procurement arrangements would have recovered.
That's correct.
Again, just briefly by way of context, Scotland, in common with the other nations of the UK, owned its PPE within the PIP stockpile. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
But the procurement was in fact coordinated by Public Health England on behalf of all the four nations.
For the stockpile, yes.
Scotland liaised with UK counterparts on the procurement of any items into that stockpile. Did that include you as Cabinet Secretary? Were you part of that liaison?
No, I wasn't. That would be led by our NSS, which was our national procurement arm in Scotland.
Thank you. We'll come to them shortly. Last week in his evidence, the UK Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, talked a bit about the stockpile. Can we bring up, please, the part of the transcript of his evidence? It's PHT 60159. Can you see the second line here? This is Mr. Hancock's evidence last week.
Yeah.
He's talking about January 2020. And he says, we in the department could foresee the likely potential, which Professor Whitty put at 50-50, of a global pandemic. Moving down a bit, he says, in the last 10 days or so of January 2020 is when we put in place a whole series of actions to mitigate the gaps that immediately became evident. One, having been reassured we had an adequate stockpile, which you can see in the middle of January and before the pandemic, by the 30th of January, when I asked for the audit comes back and there are serious problems. And just towards the end, he says, so at that point, I instructed that we got going on all the things we needed, including the fact that whatever the nature of the pathogen, we were going to need more PPE because you can never stockpile enough PPE for a whole pandemic. Thank you. Thinking specifically about PPE and the stockpile from your perspective as Scottish Health Secretary, did there come a moment when it occurred to you or you realised that the PPE stockpile available for Scotland could or would be insufficient in the face of the oncoming pandemic?
So that came from NSS, who were alerting my officials to the fact that their long-standing relationships with suppliers was bringing them intelligence that there was a growing and competitive global market for PPE that was being squeezed, if you like. And that would be when so they were intelligence gathering. I think I've spoken before at the inquiry about clinical intelligence gathering that was going on with our chief medical officer and so on. So it was a kind of parallel intelligence gathering through NSS and their supplier contacts about an emerging increased global demand for PPE, and consequently what they believed they needed to do to secure existing supply, but also to look to increase supply.
You've mentioned NSS, and as the first, we'll be hearing from them later, but as the first witness today, for those unfamiliar, NSS, is this right? You say in your statement, was established in 1974 with the name the Common Services Agency.
Correct.
And you say it acted as the single procurement arm for the whole of the NHS in Scotland. Is that right?
That's right.
What did that cover?
So that covered all items of procurement that would be needed in a health setting. So that's from items of kit, PPE, and of course during the pandemic, as you and colleagues will know, they extended their work into, for example, vaccines and test and protect. But they are the single procurement arm for all kit and consumables, I think is probably the best way to put it, for our National Health Service in Scotland.
As Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, were you ultimately politically responsible for that activity?
Yes, because NSS is a board like in other instances, territorial boards. We have territorial boards in Scotland, and we have what we call national boards, i.e. boards that cover the whole country, and NSS is one of those.
So accountable to Scottish ministers, and while you were in post in the pandemic, they reported directly to you, did they?
Yes.
Thank you. You make a number of comments in your witness statement that I want to ask you about in relation to NSS. First, you say it's a unique and distinctive feature of health infrastructure in Scotland. And you make this point: the experience of NSS gave Scottish ministers a significant advantage in the management of the pandemic compared to other parts of the UK. Can I ask you to expand upon that from your perspective? What do you or did you then understand to be the main differences in the management of the pandemic as regards NSS?
So there are a number of elements to that. First of all, the length of time that from the Common Services Agency through to its operation as NSS, that it had been around. It had long-standing established relationships with suppliers across a range of consumables for NHS. It had well-established relationships with clinical and other advisors on the nature of what comestibles or supplies might be needed and how that would develop over time through improvements in healthcare and innovation. It had a well-established procurement process of due diligence and probity to test suppliers' probity, but also their capacity to deliver, which meant that for us, I also had a level of expertise in the whole field of procurement, that meant that when we had something like a pandemic, then we already had this established, experienced body of expertise and due process that we could then use and apply to the situation that we were then confronted with.
One thing you mentioned in your statement is economies of scale. What do you say in relation to NSS and its ability to bring economies of scale to the procurement of PPE?
Well, from a supplier's point of view, we have an established body of some standing that, if you like, a supplier can trust to be accurate in its order and its specification of what it requires, and trusting in terms of payment of due invoices for supply. So you've got this established body from the supplier's point of view. From NSS's point of view, it's procuring for the whole NHS in Scotland. So its volume demand is high, and that means that you can negotiate reasonable prices for whatever it is that you are seeking to procure simply through the weight of your order, and also internally you can streamline your processes so you are minimising the cost of your procurement work because you're doing it at such scale.
You'll be aware that the inquiry has heard a lot of evidence about the operation of, in England, a high priority or VIP lane for the procurement of PPE. You've talked about how NSS worked. Did that mean that Scotland needed to operate a fast-track system for new suppliers?
Absolutely not. We had, as governments did in the other 4 nations, we had offers of help and assistance, and that would come to me directly from other MSPs or by email, or would come into government externally. All of those were then passed straight to NSS, who, in collaboration with their colleagues in Scottish Enterprise and Scottish Development International, had a proper triage process that would apply due diligence to all those offers, standard due diligence that would be the case in normal times, if you like, which would then allow them to make decisions about whether or not these new offers from suppliers or new suppliers of offers were appropriate to look to award contracts. And I think, as I know you will have seen, in the Auditor General for Scotland's report in October 21, they concluded that there was no evidence of preferential treatment or bias in any of the awards made. So we did not have a VIP lane, and we did not need one.
Were you aware of the operation of the high priority lane for PPE procurement in England at the time?
At the time, I don't believe I was. I think it would be fair to say that I can't think of another way of putting it other than to say I had enough on my plate to make sure that we were doing things at pace and appropriately, to be looking at how others might be procuring their PPE. I obviously became aware of it and would have views thereafter, but not at the time.
Well, you've said you have views thereafter. Are they views that would assist the inquiry?
Well, my view is I think there are many questions to be asked, and I'm sure the inquiry will do, about the operation of a VIP lane and the application of due diligence and probity to any offer of supply, especially when two things: when you are using public money for that purpose, and secondly, when the quality and appropriateness of the PPE secured is critical to the safety of your staff and the patients that they are treating.
One thing you mentioned was clinical input and advice. Is it right that NSS had a route for input of clinical advice?
Yes. So, as I think the inquiry is certainly aware, and I'm sure you are, our office of our Chief Nursing Officer was our lead office for infection prevention and control. And so as guidance was produced in an iterative fashion, actually, as we became more knowledgeable about the nature of this virus, how it transmitted and so on, guidance would be issued on the type and range of PPE that was appropriate in different settings, in health and in social care. And that then informed NSS about the volume of stock it needed to try to secure.
NSS also had a role in managing Scotland's PPE stock, is that right?
That's right.
You say in your statement that they tracked both the source and destination of items of PPE in Scotland, and that you received what you call a daily sit rep. Does that mean situation report?
Yes, I did.
What did that entail? What did that show you?
So what that showed me every day was every item of stock, what we had at hand, what was expected by way of confirmed orders and when they were expected, and it was traffic lit. So I could see at a glance where we had particular problems because we only had stock at hand for another 2 weeks or whatever. And that is based on NSS's knowledge of the volume demand coming in to it, or anticipated from health boards, but also its modelling that it would be doing. So I saw every day, and I don't think there was ever a day where there wasn't red in that sit rep. And that would allow me to follow up directly with NSS. What are we doing? We've got orders, but we don't expect them in time. What's our backup plan? What else have we got? So I could pursue where it looked like we might have difficulty in securing sufficient supply to meet the demand that we were modelling would be needed.
You said you can't recall a day when there wasn't red. Red being
that the stock is low. So sometimes red would be that the stock of a particular item was low. We only had 1-2 weeks of it left in store, if you like. We had an order, and the order was due to come in 1 week, but we didn't have the order yet. So that could be red. But equally, it could be that there was an order for a particular volume, but it wasn't expected for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So red could be one or the other.
Can we look briefly, please, at the Audit Scotland report of June 2021? There's the front page for you. It's INQ 000 108 737. If we could turn to page 4, please. Can you see the top left-hand box? I'm sure this is a document with which you're familiar. It says centrally held PPE stocks were very low at points during April 2020 as stock was rapidly distributed to NHS boards. 0.3 days worth of stock of long-sleeve gowns, 1 day of FFP3 masks, 2 days of visors. So at that point in the early pandemic, is this fair? Stock of that type of PPE was really very low.
Centrally held stock was low.
Yes.
What that means is that our boards had the level of stock that they said they required, and that would be adequate for their purposes. What we didn't have centrally was only that amount of stock should they need an earlier resupply than was expected.
That's very clear. What did you understand the reasons to be for those levels of centrally held PPE stock in the early pandemic to be so low?
Because of the nature of the global market and the demand. So although I said earlier that Scotland has an advantage because of NSS procuring for the whole of our NHS in Scotland, in global terms, that was still relatively small compared to even England, a bigger country, bigger demand, before we even go beyond these shores. Competitively in that global market, Scotland was not obviously at an advantage, except that we had long-established relationships through NSS with suppliers, which they could leverage in order to try and ensure that where orders were being placed, those orders would not be gazumped, if you like, by an alternative order that was new to that supplier from a larger country or a larger demand.
Can I ask you this question directly? Did Scotland run out of any item of PPE or key healthcare equipment at any point?
No. No, we didn't, although it is important for me to caveat that. We're saying, while we did not run out at any point, we obviously came very close. Where there were issues was in the timious distribution of PPE to where it needed to go, not only in hospital, in our acute settings, but also as we expanded our supply of PPE to all of primary care and to adult social care, both residential and at home.
The expansion into adult social care, was that a particular area of challenge for you?
It was a particular area of challenge for my officials and NSS, because adult social care, be it residential or at home, traditionally had, pre-pandemic, had secured its own PPE, as had primary care, because by and large, pharmacies, GP surgeries, opticians, dentists are small businesses, as is much of residential adult social care. And so they operated as small businesses and secured their own PPE. In that circumstance of a global market for PPE that is highly competitive and very challenged, it was very difficult for them to secure their orders, and they needed more in addition. And so that was why Scottish Government, I took the decision that we would take over that supply through NSS. Now, that is a logistical challenge, both in establishing a demand route so that those various parts, both for primary care and adult social care, can tell NSS what they need, what their volume demand is. It's also a challenge in distribution. Two completely new elements to NSS's work and Scottish Government's work. So it was a logistical challenge to set that up at pace, get it right, and improve it as the problems with it became evident. And you'll have seen the timeline of when those improvements were made.
And what is your assessment of that timeline?
So I think the timeline is pretty impressive in the establishment of local hubs, of the triage helpline with NSS, of the helpline direct helpline for social care and NHS staff to contact an email line to contact us with particular individual issues. For example, they might go on shift, they couldn't find, they didn't have the PPE they needed, to do the top-up delivery direct to residential care homes, and then the direct delivery route. I think in just over a month, all of that was achieved. And one of the improvements that was made inside the NHS was the creation of a single point of contact in our acute settings, in our boards, and the switch. So pre-pandemic, in a health board, the PPE that they received from NSS, they would hold centrally, and the different parts of the acute setting would make a demand for that PPE, and it would then be distributed. What we switched that to was a push approach, if you like. So when you get the PPE in centrally, push it out to those that need it. Even if they're not going to use it immediately, at least it is close to them, and when they do need it, they can use it.
You've talked about the establishment of the PPE helpline. This was in April of 2020, is that right?
Yes.
And by July, you say it was effectively closed down?
Yes.
We're hearing later from the witness Paul Coquette, Director of PPE in Scotland, who tells us that one of the early tasks of the directorate he established, or that was established with him, the PPE directorate, was, quotes, carrying out a review of a helpline established at the start of the outbreak, where any NHS staff unable to secure the appropriate PPE could email us in to ensure supply. That's what you're talking about.
Yes,
here,
it is.
He says this: the system had been set up urgently and there were failures to respond adequately or quickly enough due to administrative systems failures which required an overhaul of the helpline. Do you recall that having to take place?
Yes, I do. And we also benefited from the assistance of one of my ministerial colleagues, Mr. Day, who was Minister for Parliamentary Business, was his role, and he asked if he could help in any way in our overall response. And I asked him to oversee the operation of the helpline and make sure that the calls or the emails that were coming in were responded to quickly and the issues that were being raised were resolved, but also to identify for me if there were particular trends. So we were seeing, if you like, the same issue being raised more than once or in more than one place that would then alert us, for example, to establishing the single point of contact in health boards.
Can we look briefly, please, at a paragraph in your statement? It's INQ 000531855 at page 24, paragraph 80 of your statement. You very helpfully provided a table showing the number of emails received and responded to from the helpline mailbox, as well as the median processing time for the first month of its operation. Can you see that?
Yes.
If we look in the first part of the timeline, in the first week there, 365 emails received, 244 responses, and immediate response time, is that 20 days?
I believe so.
And by the time we get to the end of April, we can see there's, in fact, the numbers suggest more responses than there were emails, and only a day of response time. Did the problems that Mr. Coquette describes there, the need for an overhaul, does that explain some of the early delay and lack of response and how that was resolved?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So it was, as he says quite rightly, established very quickly because I wanted to have a means by which staff on the front line could raise directly with Scottish Government issues that they were experiencing on shift, and that we could then respond to those. But that did, partly, I presume, because of the speed that it was set up. It produces, as Mr. Coquette says, those administrative glitches, and the system didn't always work very well, or people who were responsible for responding, in other words, tracking down what had gone wrong and sorting it out, were perhaps not aware of everything that, or all the routes that they could pursue. And so the median response time was too slow. And then there was a review and it improved considerably.
Do you think the speed at which it was built and the need for the overhaul, and as we can see, the result of the overhaul, certainly by the end of April, does that tell us anything in terms of preparedness or lessons learned in the event of a future pandemic?
Yes, I think it does. I think the email helpline was exactly the right thing to do. I think the speed with which it was set up was the right thing to do. But I think one of the things that we need to recall is that a lot of those officials who were drafted into that task were not necessarily officials from health, the health director of Scottish Government. There was redeployment of Scottish Government civil servants all over into health from different parts of government. And perhaps what it tells me is that we need to give them more support as they move perhaps from agriculture and fish into this, or events into this area. More support that's almost like a script about, if it's this kind of query, here's how to track down what's actually happened. Here are the points of contact inside health boards. You know, here's where to go, so that they, if you like, have a better level of support to respond to the queries than they initially had.
As a more general reflection in relation to procurement processes and preparedness in particular, so that was quite a specific example, can we look very briefly, please, again at the Audit Scotland report from June 2021, INQ 000108737. It's at page 3. Thank you. The left-hand box says this: the Scottish Government could have been better prepared to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Scottish Government did not fully implement improvements identified as part of pandemic preparedness exercises, and could have done more to ensure access to PPE and related training in its use. Now, appreciating, as you say, Ms Freeman, that you were not in post during any of the pre-pandemic exercises, Cygnus, Silver Swan, Iris, but reflecting back now, do you think that anything more could or should have been done in Scotland to prepare for pandemic PPE procurement?
I'm not sure that I do think that. I'm not sure that I can think what more NSS could have done. I think for the next pandemic, I think we are much better placed in understanding, for example, the importance of wrapping our arms around from the outset all of health and social care, regardless of the model that may exist. I think we are also better able to, and so have those logistic routes and so on. We know how to do that now. We know how to avoid some of the earlier glitches. In terms of access to PPE, related training and its use, I think there is a point about, for example, fit testing for the FFP3 masks and making sure that remains up to date, and also making sure that that training and the fit process is adequate for an ethnically diverse population.
You mentioned briefly, but importantly, the work in taking over procurement for the adult social care setting. Mm-hmm. You may be aware that a concern in the evidence, we heard from Helen Whately, the UK Care Minister. You've seen, as part of your preparation, the witness statement provided by Scottish Care. A real concern about the prioritisation of PPE for the NHS as opposed to for social care, leading to real difficulties amongst providers in being able to get that PPE. Do you have any reflections on the proper prioritisation of the social care sector within the procurement of PPE, from your experience?
So, I would say that I do not entirely agree with Dr McCaskill that we considered the social care sector as secondary
Just
to the
pausing
NHS.
there, that's Dr McCaskill of Scottish Care.
Yes.
Yeah.
As I think it would be fair to say that as soon as he and others raised those problems, the problems that individual care homes had in securing both the quantity and the type of PPE that they needed. As soon as that was raised, we acted quickly to ensure that we could be the supplier of that PPE. And I think NSS responded very quickly and very collegiately to trying to work out with Dr. McCaskill and others what would be the best route for individual care homes to provide their volume demand information to NSS. We initially distributed through the local hubs. There were problems there in terms of individual care homes feeling that they were not, that they were losing out in some way. And we then did both the one-off top-up supply and the direct distribution. So I think we responded very quickly to the issues that were raised because we understood the absolute importance of adequate PPE in our residential and at-home social care sector. And we also extended it to unpaid carers, to personal assistance for people with disabilities, and to the third sector.
Two more brief points of reflection, please, before I finish. About Four Nations working. You're aware that Nicola Sturgeon, the former First Minister of Scotland, was asked whether she agreed with a comment from Boris Johnson in his evidence to the inquiry. His comment was this: we, the UK, should probably try to proceed as one UK with the simplest possible messages and decisions. And Nicola Sturgeon's answer is, I do not agree with this. And she gives her reasons. Can I ask, what do you make of that suggestion from the former Prime Minister?
Well, first of all, I don't think we had differing messages on the guidance around PPE. In fact, I know that we did not. We perhaps from time to time exercised a position where we argued for and, if you like, permitted more professional discretion by staff, regardless of the guidance. If they felt they needed a higher level of PPE, then they should be able to use that. If what the former Prime Minister means is that we should have a single procurement route, then I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that for two reasons. First of all, I think that removes or undercuts the necessary democratic accountability that devolution demands of a Scottish Government, and I think that is a good thing, that there is that democratic accountability. And secondly, from experience, the route that the UK Government took with the VIP lane and so on is not a route I would wish Scotland to take. And so having a single system, if all parties are not equal in that regard, could lead to a situation where Scottish ministers are accountable for actions over which they had no say, but with which they disagreed. That is not to say that we shouldn't have cooperation, we shouldn't have exchange of data, exchange of approaches, and what we did have, the mutual aid agreement, whereby we would help each other out in terms of the supply of PPE, where any one of the four nations was particularly struggling in any regard. And we both benefited from that and contributed to it as Scotland.
So lastly then, can I put to you, please, one of the recommendations of one of the Module 5 experts, this time on supply chains, Professor John Manners-Bell. Can I bring up briefly, please, INQ 000 474 864 at page 132. This is his author recommendation 19. Can you see there on the screen?
Yes.
He says a structure should be established to enable formal communication between the UK government and devolved administrations on PPE and healthcare equipment issues, meeting regularly in business as usual times to monitor the market and plan for emergencies. Although devolved administrations will continue to manage their own procurement operations, data sharing and shared decision-making will be encouraged. taking into account the answer you've just given, from your point of view and reflecting on your experience, do you agree with that recommendation?
I think I would be in agreement with it all until we get to the point about shared decision making, because I think it would be entirely appropriate for each of the 4 nations to reserve the right to make their own decisions for which they are democratically accountable.
My lady, thank you. Those are my questions. There are some from other call participants.
There are, I think, Miss Morris, you're going first, I think.
Thank you, my lady, and good morning, Ms Freeman.
Good morning.
I ask questions on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK. And sort of following on from the questions that you've been asked by counsel to the inquiry, the theme of my 3 brief sets of questions is around the interaction between the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government around procurement. The first topic is around funding, please. Your colleague, Kate Forbes, MSP, wrote to Steve Barclay, then the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, on the 12th of May 2020, jointly with the other devolved administrations, to express their, quote, collective concerns in regards to the limited supply of PPE currently being delivered through the UK-wide procurement approach. And they said in that letter that this has resulted in the devolved governments incurring significant costs to secure sufficient PPE to protect our frontline workers. They went on to say that the DHSC cannot currently guarantee the UK government-led PPE procurement can meet the needs of the devolved administrations. That they were generally supportive of there being a protocol for devolved PPE purchasing as well as a UK-wide approach, but they were looking for some assurances that the DAs would receive funding for DA-purchased PPE. It's a long build-up, forgive me. I'm seeking to understand what your understanding was of the intended UK-wide procurement approach in May 2020.
So my understanding of that was that that anything secured through that UK-wide procurement approach would then be proportionately distributed across the 4 nations using the, if you like, the standard formula for distribution. There was always a debate as to whether Scotland's share of that was 8.2% or 10%. I have to say it depended who you were talking to, but that was the way it would work, and that was how Scotland would, having contributed to the UK-wide approach, would then benefit from that approach.
And what did you think some of the advantages and disadvantages of that were?
So an advantage of it is that we have an additional route, and it is a UK-wide approach. So again, in that global market where you're competing with other countries, then to do it as 4 nations together, then the volume demand that you're taking to suppliers gives you some leverage. So there is an advantage to that. The disadvantage to it is if you do have quibbles about what your share is going to be, then you can't plan with confidence that you will receive the share that you expect without argument. And with hindsight, that there may be occasions where that UK-led approach does not operate the level of due diligence and probity that I would expect of government procurement.
Thank you. And I think you've already touched on this next question already, but is the UK-led procurement approach, in your view, preferable to the devolved approach? From what you say, you seem to favour the devolved approach, devolved decision-making, familiarity with your own manufacture base, ability to be able to have that direct contact, or do they both work side by side in your view?
So in my view, the devolved approach is the better approach for the reasons that you've outlined, and also because it was the devolved approach that allowed us to create a significant domestic supply chain in Scotland during a pandemic. I think just over 80% of our PPE was domestically procured. That is a protection against future global challenge. So a devolved approach allowed us to do that. And I go back to the point about democratic accountability. As a government minister, I was democratically accountable to the people of Scotland for my decisions and my actions. That is entirely appropriate, but I want those to be my decisions and my actions, not somebody else's.
Understood, thank you. Were you aware that Her Majesty's Treasury had provided a funding envelope to DHSC on the basis that they would procure sufficient supply of PPE for the devolved administrations?
I think I had some awareness of that, but all of that side of the activity was appropriately led by Ms Forbes.
Okay, thank you. Did you have any concerns at the time about the ability of the DHSC to meet the expectations of that PPE supply to the DAs?
I think my view was broadly that's interesting, but we'll get on and do what we need to do as well.
Okay, thank you. Next, please. In his statement, Mr. Coquette says that he attended Zoom calls between yourself and Matt Hancock to discuss two issues that arose regarding PPE supply and a Four Nations cooperation. The first issue was that the FCO had instructed UK embassies to withdraw embassy support from the Scottish Government when negotiating contracts in foreign countries. Were you aware of that?
I was.
And the second issue, that the suppliers of PPE in England, forgive me, have been instructed to prioritise English NHS settings over Scotland, even where suppliers were contractually committed to Scottish supply. Again, second issue, something you recall discussing with the Health Secretary at the time.
I do.
Mr. Coquette says that he recalls yourself, the Cabinet Secretary, unable to elicit any sort of response from Mr. Hancock during those Zoom calls. You were there on those calls. Do you accept Mr. Coquette's description of these issues, and what was the impact of those conversations on the PPE supply in Scotland?
So I don't believe, to answer the second part of your question, first, I don't believe there was a significant direct impact, negative impact, because we also had our colleagues in Scottish Development International located across the globe producing a significant advantage to us in their local contacts and so on. And I've already spoken at length about the value of NSS and its relationship with suppliers. In terms of the particular meeting, if I'm completely honest, I did not expect Mr. Hancock to say, yes, you're absolutely right, and that's shocking, and I'll make sure it doesn't happen. But what I know I was doing was laying a marker down that said, we are aware of this, and I now expect you to do something about it without you actually admitting that it exists.
Thank you, that's helpful. And my final and brief topic is around Cobra meetings. You say that you attended Cobra meetings, which you say you found to be of interest but of no direct benefit to your work. Why was that? Was anything discussed about Scotland? And should Cobra have been more focused on Four Nations working in collaboration?
Wait a minute. The subject of this module, Ms Morris, is procurement. So do you want to rephrase that question to relate it to... And I can't actually see in the questions I've allowed that I given permission for this, have I?
Yes, my lady, you have, yes.
No, it's not on my list. Anyway, okay, but...
Forgive me, in relation to procurement.
Yeah, thank you.
Apologies.
I don't recall procurement being discussed at Cobra meetings. And as I've said before, my view of Cobra meetings is that they only work if all parties to it have equality of status, and that was not my experience.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady. Forgive me if that was my error.
Thank you very much, Ms Morris. Very grateful. Ms Mitchell, I think you're next.
I appear as instructed, as I think you'll probably remember by now, by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved, and I have some questions for you this morning. The first question relates to not running out of PPE, and we've heard your evidence given this morning that you didn't run out of PPE. We know from the Audit Scotland report dated June 2021 that a Royal College of Nursing survey of members showed that 25% of respondents in Scotland working in high-risk environments had not had their mask fit tested, and 47% had been asked to reuse single PPE. We know that a BMA survey of Scottish members in April 2020 found that 29% of respondents who carried out aerosol generating procedures reported shortages of full face visors, and 13% reported shortages of FFP3 masks. It was also the experience of the Scottish COVID bereaved themselves that there was no PPE available, or PPE was being used against manufacturers' recommendations, including PPE not being changed between handling different patients. Now, you've explained this morning the new system that was set up to meet the link between having sufficient PPE but not being able to get it distributed. And that appears to be where the link has fallen down. The question that I would like to ask was, were you aware at the time that doctors and people on the front line weren't receiving what they needed? And how did you find that information out?
Yeah. Thank you very much. So the answer is yes, I was. Not necessarily of every instance, but I was aware through three principal routes, I think I'd say. First of all, the helpline, where people were phoning in and saying they didn't have what they needed. And Mr. Day's work on that to identify, as I said earlier, trends as opposed to one-off. Secondly, through both those surveys and our regular contact with the BMA and the RCN and RCM, but also Dr McCaskill of Scottish Care raising issues, and the trade unions. But actually, there's a fourth route, and that is where individuals might email me directly. And I think I've told the inquiry already about the contact I had from an A&E consultant on shift who emailed me on shift in the evening to tell me that he was in A&E and he did not have the PPE that he needed. And upon investigation in real time, I discovered that he did, but it had been put in a cupboard near A&E and nobody had told him about that.
Yes, I think
so. So there was a number of routes by which I was made aware of these matters, and where we could, we sought to address them as quickly as we could.
And touching on that last point, addressing it as quickly as you could, were you aware of the time lag delay between the number of people contacting the helpline and, first of all, that some people were not being responded to, it would appear, and those that were responded to, there was a very significant time lag?
So from the table that we saw earlier, at the very start of establishing the helpline, there was a significant delay in responses, but that swiftly improved. So I was aware of a delay. Again, that would come to me even before Mr. Coquette conducted his review, because MSPs would be telling me about it, or trade unions would be telling me about members who'd contacted and were still waiting on a response. So the pace with which we set it up in part explains the initial delay in responses to individuals. I'm well aware, though, if you're on shift and you don't have adequate PPE, then that doesn't really help you. All I would say is, as soon as we were aware of delays and what we could do to improve them, then we acted to try and make those improvements and be better at responding.
I wonder if I might then move on to the issue of distribution. This has already been touched on by my learned friend, who I think we'd been given very similar grants for questions. But if I might be permitted a follow-up question. Our question had been, the bereaved were aware of complaints that suppliers in England were instructed to prioritise English NHS settings over Scottish ones, and they understood that this caused you concern. And that's obviously something that we have just touched on. You've said that those were addressed in a meeting, and you made it clear that you were aware this was happening and ought to stop. My question was to you, who did you raise those concerns with? We now know that that was direct with the Health Minister for the UK, Mr Hancock. How were they resolved, i.e. once you'd said, we know this is happening, can it be stopped? Did you follow it up and did you get a response that it was being stopped?
So I never received a formal response, if you like. If I'm completely frank, I never expected one. All I cared about was that you now know that we know, so can you stop it? And the follow-up was that, to the best of my knowledge, in looking to double-check whether that still appeared to be the case through NSS and by other means, it appeared to have stopped.
And by that, do you mean you appear to be getting in more PPE from suppliers that you hadn't been before?
So it appeared that suppliers were not being advised to prioritise one nation over another, and that in terms of of the UK's embassies abroad, which of course are there to represent all 4 nations of the UK, then the obvious approach that they had been taking was stopped.
Moving on, we heard what you said in your evidence about not being gazumped, and I want to ask you a little around the purchasing of PPE by Scotland and by the UK and how they interacted with one another. There was at the UK level obviously a scheme for the centralised ordering and distribution of PPE, and we heard also, you've explained that Scotland participated in mutual aid but maintained its own supply and distribution routes. There has been a concern raised in some of the documents that have been seen that if the various administrations were bidding on the same PPE, particularly from China, the UK would effectively be bidding against itself, i.e. Scotland might be bidding for something that the UK was bidding for and we're all trying to get the same PPE. Were you made aware of these concerns, and if so, what was done to address them?
So, in order to answer that, I need to briefly remind all of us of the different nature of the NHS between Scotland and England. So, pre-pandemic, the NHS in England operates on the basis of individual trusts, which are standalone entities. And so each of those individually would be looking to procure its PPE in normal times. The UK exercise was for a pandemic stockpile. In Scotland, NSS was we don't have trusts, we have boards. NSS was procuring for all of them. So in a competition, if you like, NSS's volume of demand would inevitably always be greater than an individual trust. In a pandemic situation, then the UK procurement is looking to procure for 4 nations. Scotland is looking to procure for Scotland. My view is NSS was using long-established suppliers and relationships with those suppliers, and was obviously using its long-standing relationship leverage with those suppliers to remind them that I can't think of another way of putting it, if they dumped us in favour of somebody else, then there would be a time when the pandemic was no longer here, and they might not be able to get that supply route back to Scotland if that is how they had behaved. Relationships operate on trust and good behaviour. So I never felt, and I was never made aware, that there was the kind of competition that your question might suggest we were worrying about, because we had this body called NSS that had worked for a long time. Plus, we took steps to create our own domestic supply route, which was a preventative measure against such a thing.
Indeed, forgive me, sorry, I understand about the supply itself and the 80%. Really what I was wondering was, we've heard lots of evidence that the PPE market became very hot and very unstable, and the prices were just going up and up and up. What I wanted to know was there any specific engagement with the UK government to say, look, let's make sure that if Scotland's looking for something, or our NSS is looking for something, or the UK is looking for something, we're not actually bidding against ourselves? And if not, would that have been a good idea?
So I can't answer that question except to say that I did not engage in those discussions. Whether NSS was having comparable discussions like that with their counterparts south of the border, I don't know, but I'm sure they would be able to answer that. There certainly had always been exchange of information and collaboration. And as I'd said to a colleague earlier, that I think is something that is valuable and should continue.
I'm obliged. Milady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. Very grateful. Can I just, before I ask Mr Thomas to ask a couple of questions, could I go back to the suggestion that suppliers in England were being told to prioritise England over other nations in the United Kingdom? Did you have reports of that, or did you have any evidence to discover whether or not it actually was happening? I appreciate people may report many things, but when you look at the evidence, you find that one report wasn't based on evidence and then got repeated. Did you have evidence, or was it merely reports that you had?
It was reports, my lady, and it was on the basis of that I raised it with Mr Hancock. It wasn't an assertion as an absolute fact with him. It was simply, I have had these reports and that's a worry. So can we make sure it's not happening?
As I thought. Thank you very much, Ms Freeman. Now, Mr Thomas.
Good morning, Ms Freeman. I'm representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Workers. I have two topics to raise with you. You've touched upon them already this morning, but if I can just delve a little bit deeper into them. Ms Freeman, I'm sure you'll agree that the importance of procurement of suitable PPE for all healthcare workers cannot be overstated, particularly those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic healthcare workers who, as we know, faced specific challenges with standard PPE. In your statement at paragraph 208, INQ 000493484, we don't need to call it up, you discuss the procurement of a range of PPE sizing options to address the fit challenges expressed by some Black, Asian, minority ethnic individuals and women. Questions. Can you help us with this? What measures were taken to ensure that these options effectively met the need of vulnerable minority health and social care workers on the front line?
So we had in Scotland a group representing the BAME community and also involving the unions, of course, that were advising us both on fit and also cultural appropriateness of PPE and PPE guidance and requirements. And we used their advice to inform, through our Chief Nursing Officer, the various guidance on infection prevention and control. But we were conscious from the outset, I think, and I think I've made this point, of the low level of data that we had about the numbers we might be talking about and the appropriateness of what we were doing. And that was one of the reasons, for example, that we advised all our health boards to do individual risk assessments of their staff and also to, I think we lowered the age in terms of from 70 to 50 on the basis of data coming to us from England. But also we did have feedback from BAME staff in one of our larger health boards that resulted in a change to guidance that then introduced an improved risk reduction framework.
Thank you. I think you've answered one of my questions, which was, did risk assessments outcomes feed into these considerations?
Yes.
And you'd say yes.
Yes.
Can I, just one small question, just to piggyback. When was all of this done?
So this was, the report I'm looking at is May 2020.
Okay, thank you.
But there were earlier ones, but I think getting to grips with what was needed and understanding the level of requirement was earlier, but that's when some of those specific actions took place.
Thank you. I want to move on to my second and last topic. FEMHO, who I represent, the organisation I represent, they very much want to look forward to improving future responses and ensuring that equality considerations are embedded in procurement processes. So with that in mind, just a moment ago, you mentioned to Councillor to the Inquiry, Mr Stoke, of the importance of keeping fit testing for FFP3 masks up to date and ensuring that it's adequate for an ethnically diverse population. I have a couple of questions arising out of that, being future-looking. Firstly, could you elaborate, please, on the specific strategies or improvements that are being planned to enhance fit testing procedures?
I'm afraid I can't. I left government in 2021, in May 21.
All right.
So I can't say exactly what government is currently doing on that,
Right.
but it certainly was something that before I left, people were very alert to.
Right. Let me move on to my final area then. What changes or actions do you consider necessary to ensure that the duties under the Equalities Act and in particular the public sector equality duty are at the forefront of procurement decision making and processes?
So I think my colleagues in NSS would say that they are very conscious of those duties and responsibilities and have those factored into the approach they take. I think it is always wise, though, to ensure that you constantly review your practice to be sure that that is happening. So that would be one of the future things. I also think it is the case, and it was clear even during the pandemic, that the quality of our data needs to be improved so we understand. There can be a temptation in Scotland, I think, if I'm completely frank, to say that this is an issue that we don't have much of. And I think that's, A, not correct, not accurate, and B, it doesn't actually matter. In terms of whether you do or not, you should still be doing it. So I think there was a heightened awareness of the impact of the virus on people from the BAME community themselves, but also the risks of staff that were different from, and in some instances greater than, other staff in our health and social care workforce. So there is a need, in my view, and I can't comment on whether government is undertaking this now or not. That's for government to answer. But there would be a need, in my view, to be sure that in your preparedness for any future pandemic, that you make sure that that is as much part of your preparedness as any other matter that you might be taking into account.
Thank you. My lady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Thomas. Ms. Freeman, thank you very much for your help. I know we're imposing on you again for certainly one more module. I've just seen a list of witnesses for the care module, but I'm really grateful to you. I appreciate it's very demanding assisting the inquiry, and thank you for your help.
Thank you very much, my lady.
I shall break now and return at 5 to 12.
Please.
Mr. Stote.
Thank you, my lady. Maybe please call Caroline Lamb.
Just repeat after me, please. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lamb. Would you please give the inquiry your full name?
Yes, Caroline Sarah Lamb.
Thank you. You very helpfully provided, for the purpose of this module, 2 witness statements. First, a corporate witness statement for the Directorate of Health and Social Care in Scotland. The reference is INQ 000498141. That's 194 pages long and dated the 21st of October 2024. Secondly, a personal witness statement, the reference for which is INQ 000512475. That's 27 pages long and dated the 30th of October 2024. Are both of those statements true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Thank you very much. You have, like the previous witness, already given evidence to the inquiry, including giving your professional background and experience, which I think included a variety of senior health-related positions within the Scottish Government. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
But by way of very brief reintroduction, you are the Chief Executive now of NHS Scotland.
I am, yes.
And in that post, is this right? Your role is to ensure that Scottish Ministers' strategy and policy is implemented by NHS boards across Scotland?
Yes. What I should say is that NHS Scotland doesn't exist as a legal entity, so my Chief Executive role is very much reflects the way in which I work with the Chief Executives of our health boards.
Thank you for that clarification. And additionally, you became the Director General of Health and Social Care in January of 2021 in Scotland. Is that right?
That's correct. It's a combined post. So in January 2021, I became Director General for Health and Social Care for Scottish Government and Chief Executive of NHS Scotland.
You remain in that post now, is that right?
I do, yes.
And in that role, is this right? You're responsible for all the directorates that constitute the Health and Social Care portfolio and are the principal advisor to Scottish ministers on matters relating to health and social care.
That's correct.
Thank you very much. You also say that you're the accountable officer for the health and social care portfolio budget. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Starting, please, with some questions about the procurement of PPE.
Okay.
The inquiry is, of course, aware that health and social care in Scotland is a devolved matter to the Scottish Parliament. Yeah?
Yeah.
And it's the Scottish Government that sets national outcomes and priorities for health and social care, approves plans within each territorial NHS board and manages the performance of those boards. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
But specifically in relation to to PPE, you say that during the early COVID-19 response, it was the Health Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response Division, or EPRR, that was involved in the initial stages of supply and procurement of PPE to NHS Scotland.
So the EPR division were involved in working with NSS around management of the pandemic stockpile. They didn't have any involvement in procurement or management of business as usual PPE. That's entirely a role for NSS National Services Scotland.
So in terms of the stockpile, part of that work involved developing principles of stock sharing with other UK nations. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you say in your statement, you raise a particular issue in relation to the stockpile. This is your paragraph 198. I'll just put this to you and ask for your comment, please. At the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were substantial stockpiles of PPE held on a four-nations basis. As we've heard with Ms Freeman, these were based on model provision required in relation to an influenza pandemic and supplemented by supplies for day-to-day NHS usage. And then you say this, however, there was limited opportunity to rotate the PPE items within the stockpile, resulting in some stock going out of date and having to be revalidated before use.
That's correct, yes, because there was, limited requirement for some items in non-pandemic times. There was a requirement, I think, particularly around FFP3 masks, and that was work that was taken forward at a UK level and essentially to test that stock and to ensure that it was still fit for use. Without that, it wouldn't have been revalidated.
At the outset of the pandemic, what was the level of concern in relation to stock having gone out of date and needing to be revalidated?
I think we were comfortable with the process that was in place to revalidate the stock, and we were very clear that we were not going to, in any way, accept any risk in using stock that was not revalidated. I think, from memory, there was some element of the stock that was revalidated initially for 3 years, but then failed a 5-year test. So we decided we weren't going to deploy that. It was quite a small element of the stock.
Before we move on from the stockpile, from your perspective, what are the key lessons learned in relation to the management of that stockpile, looking forward to any future pandemic?
So I think probably maybe the key lesson is that the quantities in the stockpile were based on an assumption of a single wave pandemic flu. And clearly what we were faced with required much more significant stock. So the stock that we're holding now has been increased substantially to reflect 12 weeks usage at the sort of levels we experienced through the pandemic.
Thank you. You say that in February 2020, the EPRR began discussions with NHS to procure additional volumes of FFP3 respirators. You talk about there being a balance. It's a balance we've heard before, but I'd like to get your perspective on it, please. And that's a balance of the relative risks between potential overspending on this necessary kit against its availability for the NHS response and the perceived level of threat from COVID-19. From your perspective, and from Scotland's perspective, if you will, where did the balance fall in terms of that?
So I think when we were moving into January and then February 2020, the balance was clearly around ensuring that we had the supply to be able to provide appropriate and adequate PPE to NHS and indeed beyond the NHS in Scotland. So that was clearly the position that we were in then, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that actually Scotland committed funding to buy PPE in advance of having any certainty of receiving or being reimbursed for that funding from HMT.
So it was, as far as Scotland was concerned, a procurement at risk?
Yes.
I want to ask you then, since you've moved to HMT, if I may, about the particular aspect of PPE procurement that relates to the Four Nations joint working. You've already said that within the initial stage of the pandemic, the Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response Unit worked to develop principles of stock sharing. Was there also work with the other devolved administrations?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
And how extensive was that work, or was it more focused on the national?
So I think throughout the pandemic we sought to continue to engage and collaborate with all Four Nations. So we sought to all work together in a number of areas, not just around the pandemic stockpile, but also around things like data and use of data for modelling purposes as well.
You say there was, in your statement, there was cooperation on the procurement and distribution of PPE as part of the Four Nations PPE plan, which first launched on the 10th of April of 2020.
Yeah.
What were the key features of that plan?
I think that the key features of that plan was around cooperation and collaboration between the four nations.
You note as well that the Four Nations health ministers met regularly to discuss the pandemic, as might be expected from the 20th of April. You say there were some 43 meetings between those ministers between April 2020 and January 2022. And in addition, you say that there was significant engagement done via the Strategic PPE Four Nations Board. What was that, please?
Yes, that was the grouping that was set up to oversee a sort of Four Nations approach to PPE.
Who was that chaired by?
That was chaired by the Department of Health and Social Care.
And did the Scottish Government and other devolved government officials attend that?
Yes.
And contribute to it?
Yes.
You say that there was a protocol initially drawn up to formalise agreement on the way in which the UK procured pandemic stock would be distributed as part of the COVID-19 response. Is that right?
Yes.
The first protocol was drawn up to meet urgent temporary needs. that might be obvious as to why that was.
Yes.
And how did that develop?
So I think that developed with a view to move to clarify the arrangements, and I suppose particularly around concerns that the Scotland, along with the other devolved nations, needed to be able to be clearly in a position to be able to procure our own PPE through our established routes, and also to understand how the funding was going to flow for that. So that was one aspect. I think the other aspect was around actually, agreeing that overall governance and agreeing the approach and agreeing that there could be both a sort of collaborative approach whilst also accepting that the devolved authorities would have, I think, absolutely appropriately need to look at their own requirements as well.
You say that by the April of 2021, so moving quite significantly on, one aspect of the board's remit, this is the Strategic PPE for Nations Board, one aspect of its remit was to facilitate, you say, UK-wide PPE demand modelling, sharing information on each country's stock positions, model requirements and planned procurement strategies. Up until that point, what was your impression of UK-wide PPE demand modelling? Was it effective?
So I think if I maybe split this into two parts. So I think in Scotland, we had recognised that we needed to have a much more robust approach to modelling, including understanding what levels of stocks were held not just centrally but locally within boards. And our modelling started off in the early days of the pandemic based on anticipated numbers of cases. And then moved to be based on staffing numbers, and then got more sophisticated as we worked with our NHS boards particularly to understand the numbers of staff likely to need FFP3 masks, for example, so the range of services that were being offered and what the particular PPE requirements would be. So our approach got more and more sophisticated, and I think that was handed over to NSS from about August 2020. To actually really provide full visibility across Scotland in terms of what we expected on demand, what the supply lines looked like when we were expecting deliveries, so that people could see what was happening. At the UK level, I think that was more challenging. We didn't really have visibility of what the UK level pipeline looked like, when deliveries would be expected. And I think it was only really after about February 2021, and probably in line with that protocol finally being agreed and signed, that there was clear agreement that there would be we would share that visibility of approach across all four nations.
Yes, you say it was by the time of that protocol. Can we just look at it briefly, please? It's INQ 000 242 496. Thank you. This is the front page of the protocol. If we could go to the third page. Can we see there about a third of the way down the note that says the UK government and devolved administrations agree to? And there's a whole series of propositions here in seeking value for money, collaboration on PPE sourcing and supply, collaborating on improved resilience. And it's this one here: share information on PPE stock, forward orders and shortage items to enable a UK-wide view of the current stock position and supply priorities to be taken. Is that the concern you were suggesting there? You said it was a challenge. Is this the resolution of that challenge?
Yes, so this is the point at which we got to that point of absolutely agreeing that sharing of information was appropriate.
In fact, you say in your statement, your paragraph 235, data sharing did in fact improve after the signing of that protocol.
Correct, yes.
Did the fact that it took, this is my suggestion, agree or disagree with the suggestion that it took so long, that it took that length of time, did that have any material impact from your perspective, and appreciating you've got a slightly different role to NSS, but on the procurement, the modelling, and thereafter the procurement of PPE in Scotland, this particular challenge?
So I think that particular challenge was one of the reasons why we were, I think, so it was very helpful to us that we had NSS, that they were a centre of excellence for procurement, that they had well-established supply routes, and I think why Scottish ministers took assurance of the fact that NSS were developing a better and better understanding, and by August, I think that was August 2020, that was pretty sophisticated of what the position was in Scotland and what was needed, and therefore I don't think there was a material impact on the supply of PPE to Scotland as a result of it taking so long to agree those data sharing arrangements. But perhaps things could have been improved if that had been in place earlier. But I don't think there was a material impact because we had NSS doing the work for us.
That's very helpful, thank you. I want to look at one other challenge. I think I could describe it in that way, in relation to Four Nations working. And this is a letter from Sir Chris Wormold to the permanent secretaries of the devolved administrations on the 16th of April 2020. Can we have up on screen, please, INQ 000 496 582. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah.
Thank you. This relates, as we can see in the title there, to international procurement of medical supplies to support a UK-wide response to COVID-19. Again, dated the 16th of April, it says, "Thank you for your officials taking part in the Four Nations meeting on Thursday, the 9th of April, to discuss international procurement efforts. As discussed on the call, UK embassies have now been instructed to work on a single UK ask on international procurement, which will include the needs of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. A focused UK ask to other governments, coordinated in advance, is the best way to obtain a supply of goods that can support the needs of the whole of the UK. The approach reflects the UK government's wider commitment to a UK-wide approach in our response to COVID-19. To enable maximum focus on procurement of supplies to be distributed UK-wide, the Joint Action Coordination Team, which is said brackets in the Department for International Trade and FCO, have, on the advice of ministers, advised the overseas network not to undertake additional work to support any new procurement asks. However, they stand ready to support any existing orders that have already been placed." First of all, this came to your attention, did it, around that time?
So it didn't come to my attention around that at that time because I wasn't in the role that I'm in now, and I was actually busily working on trying to procure ventilators at this point.
To which we'll come later.
But clearly, I'm aware of it.
You're aware of it now.
Yes.
All right. So, in terms of what it says, it talks about the approach reflects the UK government's wider commitment to the UK approach, and that being the best approach. Yep. How was that received, looking back now?
So I think, looking back, I mean, I don't think that was appropriate in that the overseas networks absolutely are there to provide support to the devolved nations within the UK. Procurement, health procurement are devolved matters. And I think it wasn't for the UK if it wasn't for England to decide unilaterally, effectively, that those mechanisms should not be available to Scotland. To maybe add that we had in Scotland Scottish Enterprise and others who worked with us in terms of I suppose particularly where NSS were considering new suppliers from overseas. Scottish Enterprise provided a sort of valuable on-the-ground checking process to confirm the ability of those suppliers to actually provide supplies. But I don't think this was an appropriate way to deal with those that any sort of Four Nations response.
You say that on the 21st of April, Ms Freeman, as Cabinet Secretary, wrote to the Secretary of State for Health, the UK Secretary of State for Health, raising concerns about that. Did she make that, as far as you're aware, did she make that view clear?
Absolutely, yes.
Can you tell us then how that aspect was resolved?
So I think in terms of that aspect being resolved, I think it was clear that those overseas networks should be available to the devolved authorities, but also, as I've said, we also had our own connections through Scottish Enterprise that NSS were able to make use of.
Another challenge that you raise in your statement, I want to ask you about this, and again, see how that was resolved and what it might tell us for future working. You say this, your paragraph 224. Early in the pandemic, the PPE being delivered to the devolved administrations through UK-wide procurement was limited. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
To what degree do you say limited? Significantly so?
I would say, well, reflecting on the fact that the majority of the PPE that was used in Scotland through the pandemic was procured by NSS, then that would imply that the supply from the wider UK was limited, yes.
You put it, if I may say, quite in these terms, quite starkly in your statement. The devolved administrations understood that DHSC could not guarantee that the UK government-led procurement could meet the needs of the devolved governments at that time. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's correct, yes. That is why we were working so hard with NSS to support them.
Did the situation mean that independent procurement of pandemic PPE by NSS went on to provide the majority of?
That's correct.
So that's the direct reason, is it?
Yes.
You also say in your statement that this resulted in the devolved administrations, focusing on Scotland here obviously, incurring significant costs to secure the sufficient PPE to protect frontline workers.
Yes, that's correct.
Can we look please briefly at a document to which you refer and to which we've already referred this morning, the Audit Scotland report on COVID-19 PPE dated June 2021. It's INQ 000108737. I suspect you won't need familiarisation, but there it is on the screen for you. But can we look at page 4, please? Can we see the bottom left-hand box? The statistics provided here are under the heading 340 million. NHS NSS awarded new PPE contract using emergency procurement procedures. 78 contracts worth £340 million were awarded to companies providing PPE between March 2020 and June 2021. 29 of these contracts, worth £98 million, were awarded to new suppliers with no competition. Can I ask you then, the significant costs to which you say were incurred as a result of that limited PPE provision, are these the costs you're talking about here?
Yes, these are the costs, and I think the concern was around the period in which the Scottish Government essentially didn't have any cover from the Treasury for the costs being incurred.
So that was something that was being briefly discussed in the evidence of Ms Freeman.
Yeah.
There was a concern, was there, about assurance for the covering of those costs?
Yes, I think that's correct. My understanding is that the HM Treasury had essentially viewed its position as funding the Department of Health, and there was some negotiation that needed to take place, and Ms Forbes, from a Scottish Minister's perspective, was primarily engaged in that, as were the other devolved administration finance ministers, to ensure that actually the devolved administrations had their appropriate share of the funding that was being made available for PPE, and that was directed to them rather than being directed to the Department of Health.
I don't think we need to go back to it necessarily, but this was resolved, was it, by the protocol that we looked at together in the February of 2021?
It was actually, I believe it was resolved earlier than the protocol.
Right.
I believe it was agreed sometime maybe July 2020, June, July 2020. The funding issues were resolved. Yes.
I see, thank you, that's helpful. So the funding issues themselves were resolved quite quickly?
The funding issues were certainly resolved in advance of the protocol being finally agreed.
That's very helpful, thank you. Final issue, or challenge if I may, as you described them in your statement, around Four Nations working, is around pricing.
Yeah.
Your paragraph 236, you say the Four Nations demand and supply meetings showed the PPE demand and supply position across the Four Nations, but one hurdle, that's your phrase, which arose in relation to that, was the pricing of PPE stock. What was the hurdle you're describing?
So the hurdle there was that initially HM Treasury wanted the Scotland and the devolved administrations to pay based on the price that had been paid for the PPE rather than the market value at the time that we were drawing it down.
So the UK Treasury requested payment or wanted agreement to sell stock at cost price when that had been of PPE when that had been bought at a time when market rates were at a peak.
That's correct. Yeah.
That was the concern, was it? You say in your statement there was an eventual change to move this to market value. How long did that take? Do you know?
I'm sorry, I can't recall how long that took.
You say this: if a decision had been made earlier, it may have increased procurement from UK stocks.
Yes. Yeah.
Why do you say that?
Well, I guess if we had thought that we were getting a more competitive price compared to the prices that we knew NSS were able to access, then we may well have, it would have made it more attractive a proposition.
I see. I want to please get your overall assessment. You've talked about tangible improvements from the February 21 protocol. You also, in your statement, talk about a DHSC PPE strategy, which covered the 4 nations. That was in September of 2020. You say that was welcomed by the Scottish Government. Why was that welcomed?
I think that was welcomed because it moved away from this concept that the Department of Health would procure everything on behalf of the 4 nations to a process that was much more collaborative. And our experience, as already outlined in my statement, was that the Department of Health procurement process was not providing Scotland with what it needed. And therefore, we were absolutely, I think, very, very reassured to have in place NSS who were able to do that work for us, which also included providing mutual aid to both England and Wales in May 2020.
Yes. You say that the strategy, in fact, emphasised mutual aid and cooperation.
Correct.
To what extent was that mutual aid, as far as the Scottish Government was aware? Do you have any examples? Do you have any sort of
So I know in May 2020 we provided, I think, 2 million masks to England and I think 1.2 million to Wales or thereabouts.
And I think you say Wales, in fact, returned in kind soon
They did,
after.
yes.
So mutual aid was operating.
Absolutely, yes.
And worked well.
Yes.
Do you think, is there any sense in which that could or should have happened sooner? These are examples pretty early on, aren't they?
They are pretty early on. I mean, it was still in a period when I think everybody was still working really hard to try and provide all the PPE that they needed. So I think it worked as soon as. Certainly, my impression from that would be that as soon as we had that comfort that we could provide what was needed in Scotland, we were then, I think, very willing to offer mutual aid to other UK nations.
So despite the challenges, there was clearly a desire and in fact a will to cooperate.
Absolutely, yes.
What then is your overall assessment of the level of effective cooperation between the 4 nations in respect of the procurement of PPE, taking into account the challenges, but also the better examples of collaboration and cooperation, as you said? What's your assessment of the effectiveness, and looking forward, what can we learn from it?
So I think that whilst it probably started off with good intentions but being a bit tricky in practice, particularly around data sharing and around that insistence on the Department of Health sort of being in the lead around procurement, I think the relationships at an official level were never bad, but I think the ways of working together improved, and what particularly drove that was that recognition that yes, collaboration is great, but you need to be equal partners in that collaboration, and that by working together we were able to do more by accepting everybody's roles, responsibilities, skills and expertise.
Zooming out from 4 nations and thinking more widely about lessons learned, from your perspective about the procurement of PPE, the inquiry is aware, of course, of several reviews and exercises carried out in relation to PPE and lessons learned. you say in your witness statement that the key issues in those reports were these. First, that the Scottish Government could have been better prepared and should have acted fully on the recommendations of preparedness exercises.
Yes, that's correct.
Secondly, longer-term solutions for PPE supply to primary and social care should be implemented. And thirdly, new approaches to stockpiling and supply chain resilience are required. You also note that the theme of one of the reviews is the fundamental inadequacy of the traditional just-in-time PPE supply system in the context of a pandemic like COVID-19. Can you expand on that? What do you mean by that?
Yes, I think so. I think we had moved in terms of the sort of business as usual approach to just in time is essentially you only buy what you only buy when you absolutely need it, and clearly in the pandemic, I think our stockpile wasn't big enough. And
Scotland's or the UK's? Scotland's share of or the whole lot?
Scotland's share of the UK stockpile was not big enough to cope with the pandemic, a pandemic of the nature of the one that we experienced. And I think the other thing is that we didn't, we worked hard now to put in place surge capacity so that the just-in-time approach, I think, particularly may work fine at a sort of business as usual when your demand is fairly predictable, but as soon as that demand starts to go off the scale, you need other arrangements in place. So you need to absolutely to have in place both that additional buffer stock, but also the ability to surge up your supply quickly in order to meet demand.
In the aftermath of the pandemic, you talk about the PPE Futures programme, which was, I think, superseded, is this right, by something called the PPE Supply Implementation Project, who took on some of this lesson learning work. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Your paragraph 180, you talk about some of the key lessons learned that they're taking forward, and one is in relation to this, the difficulties of traditional just-in-time supply routes and PPE stockpiling arrangements, which you say here were not sufficient in pandemic circumstances. A reformed stockpiling and buying approach for pandemic PPE is required. Is that work well underway? Where is it at?
Yes, that work's well underway in two respects. One is in respect of the increase to the level, the absolute level of the stockpile that we're holding, which is now, I think it's 12 weeks, but at the levels that of demand that we experienced. So it's no longer based on the previous sort of planning around pandemic flu. It's much more based around what we actually experienced. And also, and maybe NSS a better place to answer this, around working with suppliers around making sure that we've got that ability to surge supply when we absolutely need to.
Can I take you, please, to the Professor Manners-Bell conclusions?
Yeah.
INQ 000474864, to get your perspective. We've had, obviously, that of Ms Freeman, who maybe inevitably focused on the democratic considerations. From your point of view, these paragraphs here, in summary, Professor Manners-Bell is looking at the issue of future PPE and healthcare equipment supply chains in Scotland, and he's considering something you mentioned, a government consultation exercise undertaken after the pandemic. You're familiar with what I'm referring to?
Yes.
Professor Manners-Bell says this: whether a Scotland-led solution helps a UK-wide pandemic response is not at all clear. It may be useful as part of a four-nation approach, given that an enhanced NSS role may provide more visibility on PPE and healthcare equipment demand to UK government crisis planners than present levels of fragmentation. However, he says, if the decision were taken by the Scottish Government to deal with future pandemic needs on a unilateral basis, with no sharing of data or PPE and healthcare equipment between nations, there would necessarily be consequences in terms of UK supply chain resilience. And this is the bit I'd like to ask you about. Clearly, says Professor Manners-Bell, an optimal UK-wide solution should be developed which fits both business as usual as well as pandemic needs for all four nations. Until that happens, devolved administrations will feel that they need to pursue their own strategies to ensure that they address the weaknesses of the systems established before the COVID-19 pandemic. Whilst these new national systems may be an improvement on what went before, in my view, they will be suboptimal in terms of procurement and supply and not necessarily resilient enough to cope with future pandemics. from your experience, both from where you sit now and your roles at the top of Health in Scotland, but also your pandemic experience, what's your view on what Professor Mansbell tells us?
So I think he's absolutely right at paragraph 557, where he talks about an enhanced NSS role being really useful in terms of that Four Nations approach. I do think that NSS have got a huge amount of expertise and also a huge understanding of the position in Scotland with regards to demand as well. In the second bit of this, where he talks about, if we weren't going to share data, I can't imagine a circumstance where we would not be absolutely prepared to share data. I think my experience was that the challenges that were experienced were in the Scotland having visibility of UK data rather than the other way around.
Thank you. I'm going to move briefly, please, to another aspect of procurement about which the inquiry has heard some evidence, and I think in which you had some quite significant involvement, and that's the procurement of intensive care unit or ICU equipment.
That's correct.
Am I right that your involvement was in fact quite significant?
Yes, I was involved in leading our ICU resilience group, which was stood up to provide support to our boards and also support to NSS, who were involved in procuring for intensive care.
We've heard quite a lot of evidence about quite how hot the market got for that kind of equipment, a global supply chain challenge. Is that your experience?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And one of the main challenges in Scotland that you note is, it might be thought, something similar to that we've heard in relation to England, and that's about the availability of information on the number of ventilators in Scottish hospitals, which could in fact provide the type of invasive ventilation at the start of the pandemic that was thought to be so crucial. What was the challenge there, please?
So the challenge there was that although at a Scotland level, we knew how many level 3 ICU beds we had, so we knew the total quantum, we had far less, in fact, we didn't have systematic visibility on the precise locations and the precise types of equipment being used. So in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of manual work facilitated through the intensive care networks and colleagues who were working with me as part of that team to actually really understand what we had at a more granular level.
Can we bring up, please, INQ 000 495258, a paper from the Scottish Clinical Leadership Fellow Critical Care Support and Resilience Group. So, forgive the mouthful. It's Professor Gregory Eckerter? Yeah.
I'm not sure he's a professor, but
forgive me,
he won't mind being called one.
Forgive me for inadvertently promoting him. Somebody with whom you worked, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
All right. Can I see this? So this is about a key learning point he's talking about here in respect of the procurement of ventilators. And he says a key learning point is the need for a national medical equipment database to ensure that we are able to assess, when needed, the medical devices being used in NHS boards. This is particularly important, he says, in terms of enabling national procurement. Pausing there, that's a part of NSS.
Yes, correct.
We'll hear more about that later, but just to fill everyone in. National procurement to move quickly with suppliers. Numerous manual surveys were undertaken by the medical physics leads at board level to confirm the numbers. Manual surveys, are we talking literally walking around counting them?
Yes, I suspect so. Different boards will have different approaches locally. So some boards will have already had records. I mean, most boards already had records. However, there would need to be some work done to sort of check and data cleanse that, make sure they were absolutely up to date.
Just moving on a little bit, where it says however down here. However, while boards implemented this within a few days, it took days to gather the data, and Intel needed to do this. The ventilators is also a good example, where if there had been a national database, we would have had all the information required to place the national order on day one of expansion. Here we're talking about the first time it was realised a lot more ventilators were needed. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
This would have resulted in orders being secured and delivered 3 weeks earlier. In terms of costs alone, with the order of over 900 ventilators, there would have been significant cost savings, with the cost of ventilators, as we've heard from others, increasing in price daily. I don't know whether you're in a position to agree with the specifics of Gregory Eckerter's analysis here, but in terms of the general point, there isn't any data. You did it quickly, but it took enough time to significantly increase the costs. As a principle, do you agree with those observations?
So I'm not sure I do agree with those observations. I think if we had waited until we understood precisely what we had in every hospital setting and what make it was, how old it was, all that sort of stuff, then that might have been the case. But the fact is, and I'm sure NSS colleagues can confirm this, we didn't wait. So we knew how many ICU beds we had that were already equipped. We knew how many we wanted to get to in terms of the capacity increase that we were aiming for. And colleagues in NSS took the approach of immediately acting to talk to trusted suppliers. Drager's probably key amongst those in terms of trying to identify with them what supply they could make available to us. So if we had waited, then that might have been the case. But colleagues at NSS did not wait to have that granular level of detail.
In the next pandemic, you'll want that data immediately, won't you?
It would be much nicer to have that, yes.
And in fact, the recommendation for a medical equipment management system, is that now in place?
Yes, it's been rolled out across all boards. I think there's still some final checks to be done to it. My understanding is it will be fully complete, I think, by the summer of this year, 2025.
One final aspect, please, of the exercise of procurement of ventilators, and that's about what models, what type of ventilators were in fact procured and supplied into the Scottish NHS. We've heard a lot of evidence about the ventilator challenge. The Scottish Government didn't have a specific role in that, did it? That was a UK government-led initiative.
That's correct, yeah.
As part of the UK ventilator challenge, we've heard about lots of different attempts to scale up new designs. Can you tell us, were any of those new designs in fact taken on via the ventilator challenge route for the NHS in Scotland?
Yes, I think we took one type, so it's a Penlon ventilator, I think. And so we had a really well-established, maybe just to go back a step, our approach was, as far as possible, to try and procure ventilators that were of the same make that we were already using in Scotland, because we didn't want to be clinicians who are already under extreme stress to also need to deal with many different types of equipment. We wanted them to, as far as possible, to be able to supply them with equipment with which they were familiar. Where we were considering new types of equipment, then we had a process for, first of all, testing it, so to make sure that it worked as we would need it to and expect it to. So we had a group of clinicians and medical physicians who would work with new equipment coming into Scotland, and also then be able to provide support in relation to training to use that. And certainly with the Penlon ventilator, I think our view of it was that it was appropriate as a backup ventilator, but probably about the same level of effectiveness or as some of the anaesthetic machines that we had already converted to be used as ventilators. And in fact, given that those anaesthetic machines were already familiar to clinicians, it was felt preferable to be using those.
To be fair to the overall picture, you in fact say ICU, the procurement of ICU equipment and the government stockpile was an area in which DHSC, the devolved administrations and the Crown dependencies worked collaboratively right from the start And you say the DSC team worked diligently to ensure that ICU equipment was identified and distributed directly to NHS boards in Scotland.
That's correct, yes.
So there's no criticism here. It's just a it's a difference of emphasis. Isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, remembering that what is needed to equip an ICU bed is not just the ventilator. There's all sorts of accessories that are required as well. And my recollection is that actually, in what we were seeing coming through as being available to Scotland from that UK procurement, we probably took quite a lot of the accessories and less of the ventilators.
That's very helpful. Finally, this then, you talk about the lessons learned exercises here being done through a short life working group.
Yeah.
And you say that one of the key recommendations of a report done by that group in June of 2020 was this: minimising variation and limiting manufacturer of each device to a maximum of 2 per board where possible, thereby reducing the risk of human error and supporting NHS boards' longer-term investment in replacement programmes. Is that a recommendation that, as far as you're aware, has been implemented?
Yes, that's correct. So we have been, since that recommendation, I think there's been 2 reviews of the stockpile and indeed the ventilators that boards hold at board level in order to be able to double capacity as required. And we have been incrementally moving towards ensuring that there are no more than 2 makes.
Thank you, Milady. Those are my questions. There are some from call participants.
Thank you, Mr. Stoke.
Thank you.
I think, Ms Mitchell, you're going first.
Ms Lamb, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. In your evidence, you, to my learned friend, Mr Stote, counsel to the inquiry, you identified the domestic stockpile for PPE at the moment in Scotland is now 12 weeks. And that's a lesson that you identify that has come from the pandemic. Just so we can be clear, does this short period avoid in its entirety the issue of some PPE losing its age and efficacy? Is that a matter which is now we don't have to worry about?
I think we would continue to want to. So the way in which we manage the stockpile, or NHS manage the stockpile on our behalf, is aimed at ensuring that we're recycling through that stockpile so that we have to worry less about things going out of date. But given that the business as usual requirement for PPE is significantly less than in pandemic times, that there will inevitably be a limit to how much you can recycle in that way. So it doesn't altogether avoid that piece of things potentially going out of date.
So that's being monitored. And just to be clear, the word recycle, you're simply meaning that you're cycling through the stock so that the first stock to come in is the first to go out, so you're not left with old stock just constantly sitting at the bottom of the pile.
Yes, sorry, that's correct, yes.
Moving on, the inquiry again has heard, and you've been quoted some of it from my learned friend again, Mr Stote, from Professor John Manners-Bell, about he considers the way that Scotland would be dealing with things as suboptimal. The bereaved note also the observations of Sarah Ashley of Baringa Management Consultants, and what she says is that the devolved and federated system in UK healthcare added challenges in relation to procurement and distribution of key healthcare equipment, and we saw that in the pandemic. We've heard evidence of it this morning about difficulties in procurement in Scotland. And as well as those challenges, we would be losing out on benefits, namely the ability to bulk buy as a single unit, thus avoiding any possibility of getting into competition with the rest of the UK. Standing those factors, would there not be merit in having a single pandemic plan, where a single pandemic and distribution plan was agreed between all countries, still respecting the devolution settlement?
So I think that the experience through the pandemic was that arrangement didn't serve as well, and that's the reason why we used NSS so intensively in Scotland to procure for us, because as set out in my statement, we were not getting the PPE that we needed through that single UK approach. Now, could that work differently in the future? potentially that could work differently in the future, but that would need to be around a collaboration of equal partners, and I think would need to bring all the data to the table. So certainly in Scotland, we have substantially increased our data collection system. So NSS have implemented a national inventory system that gives us much greater visibility around what's being held, not just nationally, but also locally. And you've just heard what I was saying about medical equipment. But I think key to this is what was set out in that protocol around that data sharing across all 4 nations. And I think that actually there is something about some of the lessons learned as well were around that level of anxiety, particularly in social care, where people don't understand how much is available, and being able to communicate authoritatively, because you're actually involved in understanding what's happening in procurement for your country, is really important, I think.
So do you believe that knowing the data would overcome these issues that are being identified, for example, not bidding against one another in the next pandemic?
So I don't see why you can't have the best of both worlds, actually, and I think that's what the protocol was working towards, in that where all 4 nations identify a requirement that can be better supplied by a collaborative procurement, then absolutely I would think that was appropriate, but that would need to be agreed through those mechanisms that were set out in the protocol.
Milady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Ms Mitchell, I couldn't unmute myself. Right, I think it's now Mr Thomas.
Good afternoon, Ms Lamb. I represent FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Workers. I have one topic to discuss with you. It shouldn't take too long. Ms Lamb, as we look to the future to improve the procurement processes, understanding the principles of the Equality Act, and specifically the public sector equality duty and how they were applied previously, could be an important lesson to be learned. So my questions are, firstly, what changes or actions do you consider necessary to ensure that the duties under the Equality Act 2010, and in particular the public sector equality duty, are at the forefront of procurement decisions, particularly when it comes to dealing with minority groups?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that what became clear in the pandemic was that, quite frankly, one size doesn't fit all, and that there was an issue for people from minority ethnic groups and also for women in terms of being able to be, particularly the face fitting for FFP3 masks. I think we've already done quite a lot of work to try and address that. Certainly, NSS have expanded the different types of FFP3 masks that they procure, so that there is a different range of fits available. And we also worked closely with Alpha Solway, a supplier in Scotland, to actually really understand that demographic in Scotland and the demographic across health and social care, and therefore what Scottish needs are. But I think actually critical to this is not just having the supply, but also ensuring that the people who are likely to need that supply, should we be hit by another pandemic, have been fit tested. And in advance of the pandemic, we did, as part of our pre-pandemic planning, we had asked all NHS boards to ensure that their staff were appropriately fit tested. And I think the numbers have gone from something like 7,000 members of staff fit tested pre-pandemic to something like 75,000 in about 2023, I think. And I think that's something that we need to continue to monitor, because it's not just about having the confidence that you've got supply that will meet people's needs. It's actually, though, that people having that confidence that should they need to use that type of PPE, they've been fit tested for it and they're comfortable that it will meet their needs.
Thank you. Milady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Thomas. Ms Lamb, thank you very much indeed for your help yet again. And just like with Ms Freeman, I saw a list this morning and I know that this isn't the last time we're going to be asking you to help us. So I'm really sorry about the burden on you. I know you must have a huge amount to do, but thank you very much for the help you've given so far.
That's quite all right. Thank you very much.
And I shall return at 10 to 2. Thank you.
Thank you.